They catch our attention on the news. The Republic of Texas standoff, the D.C. sniper, the Achille Lauro hijacking, all have one thing in common. The FBI were called in and a negotiator was used to defuse the situation and bring it to an end. What goes on in these tense negotiations? How is trust established when life and death are in the balance? And what can each of us learn from this process? Tonight, a former FBI chief negotiator lets us in on the art of stalling for time. I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight is Gary Nesser, former chief of the FBI's hostage negotiation unit. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ernie. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's kind of hard and upsetting to say that the kind of work you do has become more popular in recent years due to the situations we've been facing.
Yeah, I don't know if popular is the word, but it's become, unfortunately, a sad reality that law enforcement agencies, FBI, have to respond more frequently to situations where folks are barricaded, suicidal, or holding hostages.
Now, as I understand it, this art of negotiating in these situations was not always the common practice for us to do.
No, this really started back in the 70s, and some of you may remember the Dog Day Afternoon movie with Al Pacino, which depicted a real event. And also in that same year, we had the Olympics in Munich, the tragedy there, and New York City Police Department realized they needed to do something to prepare to handle these a little bit better. And the FBI jumped on top of a program they started and began to spread it around the United States and the world. And it called for a more thoughtful containment, de-escalation of an incident, and opening a dialogue to try to diffuse the situation and make sure people come out alive.
We'll get into exactly the steps and what you do and how it works and what we can take from it in a minute. But the first thing that comes to my mind is, with all the attention that's come into this profession, does that make your work harder now? That people kind of know what's going to happen, and now those that you're talking to might be more educated in what you're doing. Is that a problem?
No, I don't think so. We've actually had cases where people barricaded in their homes have refused to talk with the police until the negotiator gets there. They expect...
They're waiting for you.
They're waiting for the negotiator. But when people get in these situations, often they've had less than positive interactions with law enforcement in the past. They expect the police to be very confrontational and authoritative. And yet, when a negotiator shows up and begins to say, well, tell me what happened. I want to learn more about the situation you're involved in. I want to try to help you get out of this. It throws them off in a good way, and it helps to demonstrate genuineness, respect, and leads to building a relationship that helps us get them out.
They don't come to the table knowing all you're doing is trying to get them out, and that once they get out, there are not good things waiting for them.
Yeah, I mean, they do know that's the negotiator's job, but that doesn't necessarily inhibit it. If the negotiator's doing a good job in creating a relationship, yes, I want to see you come out of this alive. I don't want to see you get hurt or your family hurt or whatever the situation might be. So even though they know that you're trying to help them, it's not necessarily a negative. You're actually being empathic and understanding.
So I just still find it fascinating, though. I'm in this situation. I've taken a group of hostages.
Right.
You're on the phone with me. I know it's not going to turn out well.
Yeah.
What's the first thing you have to know going in to negotiate with me and my hostages?
Well, there's different types of cases, but let me address the one you mentioned. Let's say the classic situation where the police have arrived outside of a bank when there's a robbery in progress. Now the robber says, okay, I'm trapped in here, but I'm going to hold hostages and threaten to kill them for two purposes: to keep the police from coming in, number one, and number two, to force them to give me a getaway car and let me leave with money. So initially that hostage taker feels empowered, that he can dictate what he wants to the police.
At that point, do they truly believe they're going to get a car and the money and get away?
I think most do. Most
Really?
do. And then after the passage of time, and hence the title of my book, Stalling for Time, they come to realize that they don't have as much power or control over the situation as they initially thought. And they're basically left with two choices at the end of the day. And one is either to resist and potentially be hurt or killed by the police, or surrender and live another day.
Take me back to the beginning of it, though. From everything we see, from the news, from all the reports that happen, what gives them the belief that if they get that car, they're going to get away? Do you have to understand that psychology going in?
Yeah, I think you do. I think, again, if you think about that robber, he came to the bank, using our scenario, he came to the bank today to make an illegal withdrawal. He didn't really think out being in a standoff with the police. That's not why he showed up. And I say he because it's almost always a he in these situations. So having not really thought that out, they're acting in an impulsive way. Now that I'm in this situation, how can I leverage what I have, the hostages, to get out? And so it's not been a real clearly thought out plan like you might see in the movies or in television. So in reality, that person quickly, usually fairly quickly over the course of hours, comes to realize that this really isn't going to work out the way I thought it might.
Okay, so now we've taken him along the way, time has passed, he's starting to realize that things aren't, and we'll get to some of the real cases in there, but we'll play with ours for a little longer.
Yeah.
When do you realize it's time to make your move in a sense?
Well, I'm not sure if you, by make your move, if you mean use tactical intervention.
But you know that you've got him and he's where you need him to be. How do you know that?
There's a lot of verbal clues. Let's say you've been speaking to this hypothetical bank robber for a few hours, and all of a sudden he starts saying things like, well, what sort of time would I be looking at if I came out? Would you guarantee that they wouldn't beat me up when I come out? You begin to hear those kinds of things that indicate he's beginning to consider alternatives other than harming himself and his hostages.
We hear tapes of these, and the negotiators always sound so calm. Are you calm because you know what you're doing, or are you just projecting calm and it's a wreck inside?
Well, it's a combination. I mean, I think really accomplished and successful negotiators tend to be people who can keep their head about them in a crisis. I quote Rudyard Kipling in my book, if you can keep your head about you when others are losing theirs. So it's a lot of self-control. It's not allowing your emotions to rule your behavior. That's part of it. You're also functioning in a team context. So there's 2 or 3 other negotiators typically helping the primary negotiator to assess what's going on and to devise a strategy. So yes, I mean, you practice remaining calm and projecting that calmness, which then has an influence on the hostage taker.
If we ever find ourselves in a situation similar to this as the hostage, or if there is someone who can threaten us with harm, what is your advice to those people that are in the situation that aren't negotiating with you? They're not. Right. They're just there as the victims.
Well, I think the same thing applies to maintain your self-control. We typically would tell hostages to avoid the extremes of being overly compliant, begging, crying, making a nuisance of yourself, or being overly defiant, and that is arguing with your captor or berating them or being judgmental about what they're doing. Try to find that middle ground if you have an opportunity to personalize yourself, to let them know that you have a family and you're a regular person too. It tends to make you least likely to be harmed by that person.
Things you say then, because I think there's a fine line between becoming a nuisance of the crying, upset, sad, and establishing that you're a human being. How does that work and why does it work?
Well, I'll give you a short little anecdote. In Holland in the 70s, they had a train taken over by some terrorists. The terrorists decided to execute one of the hostages, and they picked a man, and the man said, "May I pass a message to my wife?" And he looks to a complete stranger next to him, and he says all these wonderful, enduring things about he loved his family, and he was proud of them, and he was happy, and they shouldn't worry about him. And then when he was done passing that message, he looked at the terrorist and said, I'm ready. And the terrorist said, "No, not you, someone else." Because all of a sudden this man became a human. He also had a family, had feelings. And even though terrorists and criminals can often be cold-blooded, there's a part of their humanity that can understand and link up and sympathize with that kind of approach.
Do you have to sympathize with the person you're negotiating with? Do you have to get to understand why they're doing what they're doing, or do you just come with an understanding of what's wrong in the situation?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we always try to find out what drove the individual to be in the situation they were today. Now, we talked about bank robberies and those kinds of situations. In reality, 90% of what the police are doing are emotionally driven situations where there's no clear goal. Often a man's holding a girlfriend who's threatening to leave him. An employee's holding an employer who fired him, in his eyes, unjustly. So there's these kinds of strong emotional situations where they haven't thought out the outcome very well. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if they kill their boss, they're not getting their job back. So it's the negotiator's job in those cases to really not so much bargain with them, but to try to understand what they've been through, how they feel about how they've been treated, and to try to project an understanding. Not agreeing with, not disagreeing, but I understand how you feel. That would make me upset. I know that must be devastating for you and your family. And you earn the right then to be of influence with that person and to steer them towards another alternative solution.
Okay, let me take you into some real stories, real situations you were involved with. Right here for us, we're in Texas, so the Republic of Texas standoff. Interesting story. I was fascinated about what led you folks to first get involved with them. That they had to make that move that finally said they're not just a nuisance, they're breaking the law.
Well, obviously the Texas Rangers were the lead in that case, but down in Fort Davis, the local law enforcement community had some ongoing problems and concerns about Richard McLaren and the Republic of Texas group. I'd actually flown out there months before the incident with a profiling colleague, and we gave them an assessment of the situation and provided our thoughts of what might happen if certain conditions took place.
Your thoughts at that point were what?
Our thoughts were that if they tried to arrest McLaren by force, he would resist. That if they had lawful arrest warrants, they should try to arrest him when he was off the property so we wouldn't end up in a siege. Those were some of the ideas. There was others, and we sort of assessed his personality. Then when the actual event unfolded, I was asked to fly back down and to provide some assistance.
And just to keep our audience on the same page, they had gone into a neighbor's property and taken hostages of the neighbors, and that's what finally...
Yes, there was a dispute over some land issues, and the Republic of Texas folks had this ongoing argument with a family that lived in this Fort Davis community. The sheriff came out and arrested one of the armed Republic of Texas guys who was trespassing. In retaliation, Richard McLaren and others invaded the home of the Rose, took them hostage. So there was an exchange where the Rose were released, the fellow who was arrested by the sheriff was returned inside, and then the siege began. And that's when I was called out to provide some assistance. I worked closely with the Rangers and the Department of Public Safety officers. They did a wonderful job, and that situation was handled very well professionally, and everyone came out alive.
There was a point in the story where you need phone contact with the folks inside the Republic, and the phone lines are cut.
Yeah.
And your understanding of that is simply just miscommunication within the folks on the outside.
Yeah, what happens typically in those situations, we like to be the sole link to which the people inside the compound or the siege area, whatever you're talking about, talk only through us. We don't want them talking to the news media. We don't want them talking to their families and providing them with a last will and testament. So we want to control that. So when I got there, I noticed that had not been set up. So I requested that they do that. But I think it got miscommunicated somewhere along the lines, and they cut off communications when we were expecting a contact back from them. So it's kind of an example of how you have to be very careful how you coordinate your activities. And we were able to reestablish communications with those inside and eventually secure their peaceful surrender.
And I know throughout your career, many, many, many very successful ones. But it's funny, the ones that aren't successful, the one mistakes, get the big attention in the news.
Yeah, I mean, the Republic of Texas siege kind of fell off the radar screen afterwards, perhaps not here in Texas, but certainly nationally, as did the Montana-Freeman siege. But it's obviously the Wacos and the Ruby Ridges that create so much problem. And at Waco, of course, it's the longest chapter in my book. There were some fundamental philosophical disagreements within the FBI. I was there the first half, during which we secured the release of 35 people, including 21 children. And I think we were on track with a fairly good strategy. And there was a lot of external pressure on FBI leadership at the scene to tighten the pressure to resolve this sooner. It was very expensive and it made the FBI look powerless. And ultimately, they took a more confrontative approach that sadly broke off communications with the Davidians. And at the end, the FBI decided to insert tear gas to induce them to come out, and the Davidians started the fire that killed everyone inside.
What was the point, do you think, when it turned wrong? If you folks were on the right path, what was the tipping point?
Well, right near the end, right before I left, and I was sort of asked to leave because I was seen as an impediment to a more confrontational process. We got about 7 people out on one particular day, as I recall. And unfortunately, in response to that, the on-scene FBI commander took some very aggressive external action that in essence was the opposite of Pavlov. You know, when you reward good behavior, you don't punish it. And I told him at the time, when we train the dog to bring us the newspaper, we give it a bone. We don't kick it. And that's what we did. And that really, I think, finally capped it off for David Koresh. He said, if this is how you're going to respond to us, we're not going to let anybody else out.
Do the career of folks like you get worse now with the mentality that's been growing in this country for the last 10 years or so about strength and might, and we go in there and we show our force, as opposed to we will not negotiate with terrorists, we will not How does that alter this playing field, do you think?
I worry about that a great deal, Ernie, because I think we have turned into a point where sloganeering is almost more important. And certainly we want to show our resolve against terrorism. I don't think anybody disputes that. But saying we won't negotiate with terrorists really doesn't help at all. Our real policy as a nation is we will not make substantive concessions. So when we say we won't negotiate, it means we won't have a conversation. When Danny Pearl was held a hostage in Pakistan, his captors communicated with his employer, the Wall Street Journal, over the internet. And my agents were there helping them. We were negotiating or trying to negotiate. That was proper. It was appropriate. Negotiating does not equate to making concessions. So I think we should always try to maintain a dialogue to try to help secure the safe release of our people. It's obviously a much more challenging situation with terrorists.
When you deal with, and I don't mean it all to stereotype, but when you deal with situations in the Middle East where we hear that those particular individuals, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, they don't seem to have the same appreciation for life. If you take that bargaining tool off the table, if you become a hero, a martyr by dying, then what does the negotiator do? What do you have to deal with that?
Well, it's tough, and I mentioned a minute ago the Danny Pearl case. Although there were some negotiations ongoing, I think it's fair to say that his captors never really intended to make a trade or to engage in the negotiations in any serious way. I think they were clearly holding Danny Pearl to generate publicity for their cause and sadly to execute him and further demonstrate their willingness to exercise extreme violence. I think the negotiator's tool in those cases is to try to present how such reckless executions really work against their better interest. And in fact, we saw there was a slowing down of that sort of thing in Iraq because I think even the al-Qaeda-supported terrorists began to see that they were losing the hearts and minds of some of the people that viewed that as far too extreme.
Yeah. I'm curious back to the Waco standoff. David Koresh, when you deal with a person like that, what is unique and different about that than dealing with the everyday bank robber or somebody who has just done a wrong deed?
Well, David Koresh, I think some people might assume he was like a Charles Manson kind of figure. When in reality, when he talked about his very elaborate religious beliefs, he could certainly be a complex and challenging person to deal with. But we tried to keep him in the secular world, and in fact, all the people we got out while we were talking with him about non-religious events. So there was times where he was matter-of-fact, there were times where he was angry, and there was times where he would go off in left field, as it were. But for David Koresh, you have to understand the FBI goes to a situation where there's 4 dead ATF agents, 17 wounded, a number of Davidians killed, and the Davidians are asking us, the only thing they demanded was go away and leave them alone, the one thing we could not do. So it's a real challenge then to sort of convince them that it's in their interest to come out, to have their day in court, to tell their side of the story. And, we had some success in that regard, particularly with securing the release of the children. But it's a tough case. David Koresh ultimately knew he would have to give up his complete and absolute control over his followers. He controlled every facet of their lives, where they slept, who they slept with, and most of the time that was he who was doing the sleeping with, what they ate, where they worked, and what they did. He was a true king within his little kingdom. And I don't think he was really prepared at the end to give that up.
And I saw in the book where you do make reference to the fact you can't use words like surrender. There are certain things that trigger people. Even if you're saying the same thing, choose your words wisely in all of this.
Yeah, we all will make mistakes as negotiators. I certainly have, and I talk about some in the book where you think you're being glib and articulate, and then you let something slip out that could be problematic. But what really makes people come out is not 1 or 2 words that you say, whether they're right or wrong, but it's your overall projection of genuineness and sincerity. I used to interview hostages who would come out, hostage takers who would come out of situations, and I would typically say, "What made you come out? What did the negotiator say?" Invariably, they would say, "I don't remember what the negotiator said, but I liked the way he or she said it." And that tells you an awful lot. It's that overall projection that the hostage taker, barricaded individual sees you as sincere and genuine and really trying to help them. That's the key tool to being successful in this business.
Unlike negotiating with a spouse or a family member or a coworker, life and death is in the balance when you're doing it usually. The essence of lying, I'm fascinated by that. At what point can you stretch the truth? Where do you lie? Should you say anything you need to get them out of the situation, and then justice will take its swift duty?
Yeah, I'm not a proponent of that. Oddly enough, I do start off the chapter with a very rare case where I had to lie to somebody in order to save the life of a woman and child.
Why should that be a challenge for you, though?
Well, we know in situations we tend to get caught in lies. In many of these situations, we have to deal with these people again. You're trying to create a relationship of trust. And if you ever cross that line and get caught being deceitful, it can really be a total impediment to be able to work the situation through. So we try to avoid that at all costs.
But there have to be moments where you do, as you said.
Well, what I would not do, for example, if a bank robber says, if I come out, you promise I can drive home. I'm not going to do that.
Why not, though? Why not? If it's going to get them out of the situation, and they're not going anywhere no matter what they think they're going to get when they come out, does it make a difference if you say it's going to be kind, everyone's going to treat you well, or you're going to drive home? All of it's not going to be there.
Well, the things that I can say, you will be treated well, you get a chance to call your wife. We follow through on all those things. Can you drive home after this? No. Because if I said that, first of all, the person would smell a rat. And they would say, now you're really manipulating me. And they sense that. And so that's the bigger danger.
Okay. Take me into the whole area of what can we as individuals take out of this. I mentioned just a minute ago negotiating with a spouse or with a coworker. We find ourselves in these situations, and I have to tell you, I thought I've been so good at that till I started reading some of the things you say in the book, and then I'm like, wait a minute, maybe this aggression isn't what you need when you're trying to make a point. What can we all take from this?
Well, we all have our struggles in interpersonal communication, spouse, children, co-workers, some merchant you deal with in a store or whatever it might be. And I think a lot of times we're having a bad day and we're quick to get angry and voice our frustration, and that's almost always counterproductive. What we really try to suggest, and where negotiations evolved, particularly in the 90s, was to a crisis intervention model where the cheapest concession we can make is to listen, to try to hear the other person's point of view. So whether you're dealing with your children or your spouse, sincerely and genuinely, not in any fake way, say, I want to understand what you're thinking. I don't know that I fully appreciate what you've been through today. Would you tell me more about it? And I think when you do that, it is a powerful, powerful tool to help create a relationship. And people want to be understood. They want to be respected. They want to be treated in a genuine way. And the tools that we learned in negotiations certainly have applicability in the more broader society.
You say in the book, too, that the three things, and I keep referring to the book, and it is Stalling for Time, which is the book that you wrote. Establish a bond, address safety and security needs, and then on the rare occasion when you have to lie, you lie.
Yeah.
But with all the caveats that you gave us before. 1 and 2, I think, would work in the interpersonal and in your real lives.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the lie part, I would not even begin to suggest that should be part of your everyday conversation. I put that in there basically to suggest that negotiators, although we will achieve a success rate in the high 90 percentiles, every once in a while we have to assist the larger law enforcement effort by helping the tactical team do what they have to do. When we come to a point and conclude that this person simply will not be reasonable, they are not doing what we ask, they're becoming more dangerous, more threatening, then sometimes law enforcement has to take tactical intervention to try to save lives. And then it's the negotiator's job not to throw your hands up and walk away, but to say, how can I help this? How can I communicate with this person to help our guys who have to go in do this more safely so they go home safe to their families?
Looking at the landscape of what we're dealing with now as a country across the globe, what do you think they're doing right? What do you think they're doing wrong, and how we handle tense situations?
Well, I think diplomacy and negotiations are line skills, and I think for some time I had a sense that our country was not pursuing diplomacy as well as we should. In fact, Secretary Gates, I think, quotes Secretary, I forget her name, Condoleezza Rice, as saying, well, you have more band members in the military than we have diplomats, and that's probably true. But, we probably need to really work on those skills. Even during the Cold War, we communicated with the Soviet Union. So I think it's good to keep a dialogue open, even with problematic countries like Iran and North Korea, to try to move away from violent confrontations. We won't always be successful. But because we know we have an enemy that fundamentally thinks differently from us and poses a threat, should not mean we don't try to keep the door open in communications. So I think that's one area where we need to improve.
Do you see us moving in the right direction?
I do. I think that's improved over the last few years. I think our allies after 9/11 became completely supportive of America, and then I think they got a sense that we were going our own way on some things, and now I think that's improving again. I do worry, and I talk about in the book, that leaders, both in law enforcement and government today, may not have as much experience and education in managing a potential hostage siege by terrorists than they should have. And if they stick with the slogan of "we won't negotiate," it might inhibit us from using skilled, creative strategies to resolve situations that may not always have to be resolved through force.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating stories, fascinating book, and we can learn a lot from this, and I hope people listen, take heed.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Now, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local program bar, pick Houston 8, and you can join our online community. Read about the guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. That does it for us tonight. Until next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.